today's video, we're going to talk about how we can prepare for 5th grade Math STAAR. As a teacher, and I also know a lot of other teachers, parents, and also students want to do well on any tests, not just STAAR, but you may not know where to begin or what to study. So that's why this video is made, to help all of you be successful. Just a quick tip before we start. To make the most use of this video, I encourage you to also print the review attached in the comment section and try to solve those problems to test each skill. If you can't solve a problem, this is an indication that you need to go back and review that skill or that concept. Although I've tried to make quite a few videos to help students and parents, I know I cannot cover every single skill. But don't fret, because there is also a huge wealth of great resources from great teachers on YouTube and great videos that you can look up. So let's dive right into it. We will start with the very first skill that you need to know. It is called number sense. This skill tests your ability to understand numbers in general. You may think this is silly because who doesn't know about numbers? You've been learning about numbers since you're in kindergarten. The issue is that most students are very good with whole numbers, but not every 5th grader understands decimals and fractions as well as you may think. So with that in mind, you have to know the place value of numbers. Then comparing and ordering numbers, rounding numbers, decimals and fractions is also included in this package. And of course, we can't forget the different ways we can also represent numbers. Do these words make any sense to you? Standard form, word form, expanded notation, and so on and so forth. If you don't know any of these vocabularies, it's a good indication that you need to review this concept. Or how about this one? Can you plot a number on a number line? Again, most students do really well with whole numbers, but stumble when working with the decimals and especially fractions. Before we move on to the next section, I do want to pause right here and remind you that we will also need to know how to convert numbers that are fractions into decimals and decimals into fractions. For this, it is very, very valuable if you know your place value, just like this one, to convert. Or there's also what we call benchmark decimals and benchmark fractions that you need to learn. And when I think of these benchmark fractions that have a 2 or a 4 as denominators, I normally think of money. I think of quarters. So for example, I can think of what is 1/2 of a dollar. So 1/2 of a dollar means 50 cents. So I can write it as 0.5 or I can write it as 50 cents like that. Okay, but normally we stop at 0.5 or 5/10. And then the next one is 1 out of 4 quarters, because remember, when we think of money, we're thinking there are 4 quarters that makes up $1. So what is 1 quarter worth? It is worth 25 cents. So I can write that as a decimal, 25 cents, just like that. And again, 3/4 is the same thing. What is 3 quarters worth? Well, 3 quarters is worth 75 cents. So these are what's called benchmark fractions and decimals. They're very useful if you memorize them. Then the second skill that you will be needing will be calculation skill. Well, math is mostly about computation or calculation, so there's no surprises here. This means that you need to be fluent with adding and subtracting, even with regrouping or borrowing. And you also need to know how to multiply and divide numbers. This is an extremely important skill because it's foundational for most math problems. But what's really important in 5th grade is that you need to be able to multiply 3 digits by 2 digits. For example, like this one. And you also need to know how to divide 4 digits by 2 digits. And more importantly, as in my division example, there's a remainder. So you also need to understand how to evaluate remainders. Now, we're not only working with whole numbers in 5th grade, we're also working with the decimal numbers as well. We can also be multiplying 3 digits by 2 digits with the decimals, or we can also be dividing 4 digits by 2 digits with decimals. So under the umbrella of calculation, it can also be carried over to orders of operations, or we can call them Gemdas, where there are more than one operations that you have to solve for. Along with knowing how to compute numbers, you also need to be able to recognize what these dots mean in 5th grade and what this bar or the fraction bar means when we're working with Gemdas problems. Another skill that kind of goes hand in hand with calculation is called prime and composite. And with prime and composite, it is very critical that we know our divisibility rules. It will make your job so much more easier and faster if you know the divisibility rules. At first glance, this rule looks like there's a lot for you to remember, but you really actually don't have to. You can actually combine some of these rules. So for example, the rules for 2 works with 4, 6, 8, and 10. Likewise, the rule for 3 will, kind of the concept for 3 will also work with 9, except instead of being able to divide by 3, you can divide it by 9 or multiples of 9. And then the rules for 10 can also be combined with the rule for 5 as well. The only ones that you really truly have to test for are 7, 11, and 13. With these numbers right here, you have to manually divide. So far, the majority of all of those skills that I've been referring to under calculation so far are mostly on whole numbers. So now let's also look at decimal numbers. So some of your rules for decimals are very specific. When we're adding and subtracting decimals, we have to line up the dots and we give it all we got. One of the trick in decimal problems is a lot of times the test giver will give you one number that is whole without a decimal and then the other one with the decimals. Well, my trick is always to read them as if they're money and add in a decimal and some zeros to help you so that you can line up these decimals and add or subtract. The rules for multiplying is a little bit different. When we multiply decimals, we have to look for the number of digits that are after the decimal in the problem. As you can see, there's one line right after the decimal, so I have to put that one decimal place back in the answer. And the rule for dividing is actually very easy. So when we are dividing with decimal numbers, all we have to do is just to bring this decimal right here up to where the answer will be, and then now we can divide as if there's no decimal. I'm not going to finish the problem because I wanted to save time on another concept. Lastly, you also need to know how to compute fractions. Know the steps to adding, subtracting fractions, multiplying, and dividing fractions. All have each their own steps. So for each one of these examples, you have to know the algorithm or the steps to solving for them. And this is probably one of the toughest skills. Not because it is difficult, but because it has more steps and each operation has complete different rules than the others. So within this fractions, there are other side skills that you need to know, like how to find a common denominator or a multiple, how to find equivalent fractions, how to simplify fractions or reduce, and how to convert them from mixed to improper or improper to mixed. As you already may have noticed or seen, all of these skills actually require basic multiplication skills. With that said, we need to sharpen our multiplication facts. An idea is to continue to work on your multiplication facts throughout the summer each year, or on weekends, regardless of how well you think you know them. There are many different free games and websites with printable worksheets to help you practice this skill. Next, we need to know how to convert. This is called measurements and conversions. You won't need to memorize the conversions of units because a star chart is provided. However, multiplication and division skills are also very critical with this concept as well. Another item that we also need to remember are labels and units. Your answer must include the correct units. When reading a word problem, make sure you have a way to organize your information by sorting them according to the units that the question is talking about. A table or a T-chart work great with this concept. You will also need to know how to do one-step conversion as well as two-step conversions. And on top of that, you also may need to know how to solve these in a word problem. The next skill we're going to move into is geometry. And within this unit, there are 3 smaller units or subunits that we need to know or master. The first one that we're going to talk about is classification of polygons or shapes. In 5th grade, though, we will focus more on triangles and quadrilaterals. So within this unit, you really know your vocabulary, like isosceles, equilateral. If you don't know what the word angles, obtuse, acute means, you need to review these vocabularies. And on top of that, it's also important that you need to remember and learn some of these hierarchies. This graphic organizer is an example of a hierarchy, and you need to understand how to read and analyze them. So here's another example of a hierarchy chart that is about quadrilateral. And again, these vocabulary like parallelograms and these characteristics of parallelograms, of triangles, how I highlighted each one of those that makes a rectangle because it's got 4 right angles. Well, those are all critical points that you need to remember or memorize. And even the chart itself will be very helpful if you know, memorize it, understand how to read it, and understand how to analyze the relationship. Now that we've mastered some classification of polygons, now another subunit that we're going to look into will be finding perimeter, area, and volume of different shapes. And again, luckily, you do not need to memorize any of these formulas because they're given to you in a STAAR reference chart at STAAR. So here's how you can find perimeter, how you can find area, and how you can find volume. Well, don't just have this on your desk. During the test, actually look and refer to this chart to make sure that you're using the correct formulas. Another thing that you want to master is how these different skills are asked, when and what wordings are involved. In my videos for these concepts, I provided some helpful steps. If you use these steps regularly, they will become a system and second nature for you to help your mind stay focused. One tricky thing about these types of questions is that sometimes the word perimeter, area, or volume are nowhere mentioned in the question itself. So how do we know which skill are they asking? Well, one huge clue is to pay very close attention to the units that they're asking for right in the question itself. This trick, though, will not work for all problems, but at least for 80% of your problems, it will work. For example, if they're asking for an answer in square centimeters, you immediately know that they're talking about the area of a shape. If they're asking for cubic feet, we know it's volume that they're asking for. The key is squared is always about area. Cube, or indicated with the 3, is about a 3D shape or volume. But they still be very careful and to read each math story slowly, as well as the questions multiple times to understand what the question is asking before jumping to solving for it. If you need to, also watch my video on 3 reads on how to read word problems and how to effectively solve for them. The last subunit in geometry, and probably one of my very favorites, is coordinates. But within this subunit here, you will also need to know how to use input-output table and put those values in coordinate grids. You will also need to know additive and multiplicative patterns. Moving along, I have my fifth skill that you need to also master in fifth grade. It is called graphs and data. There is some vocabulary we need to master, such as categorical and numerical. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to search up videos to watch. Examples of categorical graphs are bar graphs, mostly because one of their axes, like right here, are in categories rather than in numbers. So that's what makes this a categorical type graph. On the other hand, a classic example of a numerical graph is a stem and leaf graph, because everything you see here are all numbers. They're made up with just numbers. So it really depends on what data we're measuring. If the graph involves words, and I'm not talking about just the titles like the title stem and leaf, they are categorical, okay? But if they're just made up of just complete numbers, then they are numerical. See, for example, this one right here, even though the titles right here are all words, but notice on the x-axis and on the y-axis, they're all numbers. So this would be considered a numerical graph. And again, is a dot plot, and although it has some labels right here to tell you what each dot means or what the dot represents, but on the line itself, they're all numbers. So we know that this is a numerical graph. So in fifth grade, some of the types of graphs that you really need to understand how to interpret, how to read it, and how to answer word problems type questions from it are your bar graphs, scatter plot, stem and leaf, and a dot plot. Another skill that is kind of included in this graphs and data unit is how you can read, interpret this information, for example, from a stem and leaf graph, and be able to put it or convert it into a dot plot. Or sometimes you may have to be able to understand how to read a bar graph and be able to put it into a dot plot, or be able to put it into a stem and leaf. So we have to be able to make connections between different graphs and how we can represent them in different ways. And this takes us to the very last unit, which is on financial literacy. And the root word finance means money. So within this unit, it's gonna be all about vocabulary. It's about knowing what the words are and what they mean. So if you don't know what I'm talking about here, like transaction, debit, credit, taxes, and there are like four different types of taxes, ledger, and there's a slew more of them. You need to review this using your notes or look up videos to watch. But there's just one tidbit that I also have to tag on to these 6 skills that you need to know. So other than the 6 skills, we also need to know how to problem solve, because a lot of your problems that include number sense, like your place value, that includes expanded notation, calculation, conversions, geometry, graphs and data, and even financial literacy, it's all about solving 1, 2, or even sometimes 3 steps word problem. So how do you solve for those effectively? Watch my video on the 3 reads. But my strategies is always to read a question the first time throughout, so you understand what the problem is talking about. And then the second time when you read it, you're going to read it sentence by sentence, and you start drawing pictures. You start labeling what you know with words. And then you're going to start substituting those words with the numbers provided in the math story, one sentence at a time. Then you're going to come up with an equation on how to solve the problem, and then you're going to solve for it. Lastly, you're going to read the question itself just the 3rd time, just a question, not the whole entire problem, just a question, and ask yourself, does your answer actually answers this question? Or you can also ask yourself, does this answer make sense? Okay, and all of these strategies will help you to be very successful on STAAR, or on any test for that matter. So guys, I know that a lot of us do stress out about this, but I do want to encourage you, if you've done your best this year or any other year, just give yourself a pat on the back and don't stress about it. It is just another test, just like, you know, we have unit tests all the time. So this is kind of like our end of the year test, and it's okay. Just do your best to review what you need to review. Do your best to learn, because truly, this is to get you ready for that next level. This is to get you ready for the 6th grade. So good luck, and I know you guys are going to do so well if you guys try your very best. Have a good day.